The train slowed as it neared the small-town station, the rhythmic sound of wheels on metal fading into a hush that felt almost sacred. Daniel pressed his forehead against the window, watching the familiar landscape roll by, golden fields, wooden fences, and the distant outline of his grandmother's farmhouse. It had been years since he'd last visited. Life had taken him far from this quiet corner of the world into cities that never slept, into offices filled with deadlines and noise. Somewhere along the way, he'd lost something precious: peace. Now, at 35, Daniel was coming home. Not because of joy or nostalgia, but because his grandmother's health was fading. Her letters, once full of strength and humor, had grown shorter, shakier. When she wrote last month that the garden wasn't blooming like it used to, he'd known it was time to return. The train came to a stop. Daniel stepped out, the cool breeze carrying the scent of pine and earth. Everything looked smaller, older, yet strangely untouched by time. The station sign still leaned slightly to one side, the same one he used to wait under as a boy when his grandmother would pick him up in her blue pickup truck. A part of him felt relief to be back. Another part felt the weight of memories pressing in. The drive to his grandmother's home was quiet. Dust rose behind the car as he turned down the familiar dirt road lined with maple trees. The house came into view, white paint peeling, the front porch sagging just a little. But the flower beds were still there, neatly kept. A rainbow of color that defied the years. His grandmother, Margaret, was sitting in her usual spot on the porch swing, a knitted blanket over her lap. Her face lit up the moment she saw him. "Danny," she called, her voice still warm, still strong in its own gentle way. He smiled, trying to hide how emotional he felt. "Hey, Grandma." When he hugged her, he realized just how small she'd become, how fragile. Yet her spirit, that spark in her eyes, was as bright as ever. "You came just in time," she said, tapping his arm. "The garden's being stubborn this year. Needs your magic touch." He laughed softly. "I'll do my best." That evening, after dinner, Daniel wandered outside. The air was filled with the scent of rain and soil. He walked past the garden gate, feeling the crunch of gravel beneath his shoes. The flowers swayed gently under the setting sun, glowing gold in the fading light. It was peaceful, but also a little lonely. He remembered the summers he'd spent here as a child, chasing fireflies, sneaking cookies from the kitchen, and talking for hours with the woman who lived next door, Emily Turner, his grandmother's neighbor. Back then, Emily had been in her late 20s, graceful, with an easy laugh that made everything feel lighter. She used to teach at the local elementary school and tended her garden like it was a living piece of art. Daniel had been only a boy, but he remembered how he'd always found reasons to visit her porch, sometimes to ask questions about her flowers, sometimes just to listen to her stories. It wasn't love, not the kind he could have understood then, but something close, a quiet admiration, a boyish sense of wonder for someone who made the world seem kind. Years passed. He grew up, went to college, moved to the city, and built a life that looked good on paper but felt empty inside. Relationships came and went, but none ever filled the quiet ache he carried. He often told himself it was just loneliness, the cost of ambition, and adulthood. But deep down, it felt like something more now. Standing there by the same garden fence, Daniel realized how much he missed the simplicity of this place, and the people who once made it feel like home. As he leaned against the fence, a faint voice drifted from the yard next door. "Margaret, your roses are still winning the neighborhood contest." The sound stopped him cold. He knew that voice. Warm, melodic, unmistakable. Even after all these years. He turned slowly, his heart thudding once in his chest. There she was. Emily stood by her own garden, holding a basket of freshly cut flowers. The years had changed, her hair now streaked with silver, her face touched by time, but the same grace lingered in the way she moved, the way she smiled. For a moment, Daniel couldn't speak. Then she looked up, meeting his eyes across the fence. Recognition flickered in hers, soft and hesitant, then blooming into surprise. "Daniel," she said. Her voice was both question and memory. He nodded, smiling faintly. "Hi, Emily. It's been..." A long time. She let out a quiet laugh, the sound gentle as wind through the trees. Long enough to make me feel ancient, she said, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. He shook his head. You look the same. Maybe even better. The compliment slipped out before he could stop it, and for a heartbeat. They both fell silent, not awkwardly, but thoughtfully, as if remembering something neither dared to name. They stood there, the garden fence between them, the sky turning a deep shade of amber. I heard you were in the city, Emily said finally. Your grandmother's so proud of you. She talks about you every week. Daniel smiled softly. Yeah, the city keeps me busy, but I guess it doesn't feel like home anymore. Emily's eyes softened. Home has a funny way of waiting for us, she said quietly, no matter how far we go. Her words lingered in the air long after she turned to walk back toward her porch. Daniel watched her go, feeling a mix of warmth and ache, like a forgotten melody slowly finding its way back as night fell. He stood under the stars, thinking about how the universe sometimes brings people back into our lives for reasons we can't yet understand, and deep inside, he knew this return home wasn't just about family. Something was beginning again. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the lace curtains of his grandmother's kitchen. The smell of toast and freshly brewed coffee filled the air. Daniel sat at the small wooden table, his grandmother humming softly as she stirred sugar into her cup. You saw Emily yesterday, didn't you? She asked without looking up. Daniel paused mid-sip. Yeah, he said after a moment. She still lives next door. She never left, his grandmother replied with a knowing smile. Even after her husband passed, she stayed. Said the garden kept her company. He nodded slowly, feeling a small tug in his chest. She looks good, he said, his tone quiet, almost careful. His grandmother chuckled softly. She's always been lovely, but it's her heart that makes her shine. You remember how she used to bring you lemonade every summer? Daniel smiled faintly. And fresh cookies. I probably spent more time at her house than here. You did? She laughed, and she never minded. Later that afternoon, Daniel found himself outside, trimming the garden hedge that had grown wild in his grandmother's absence. The sound of distant birdsong filled the air. He worked quietly, but his mind was elsewhere, drifting back to the summers that once shaped his childhood. He remembered being 10 years old, his knees scraped from climbing trees, running to Emily's porch when the sky turned dark with summer storms. She would always welcome him with a towel and a soft laugh, saying, "You bring the thunder with you." Daniel. She had been patient, always listening to his small stories about school, his dreams of becoming a pilot, his excitement over catching fireflies. He never told her, but she had been his favorite person in the world back then, someone who made him feel seen in a way even adults rarely did. And then life happened. His grandmother grew older, Emily's husband fell ill, and Daniel's visits became fewer. By the time he was old enough to understand what that quiet ache in his chest really was, it was too late. He had left for college, and the world had carried him far from those warm summer evenings. Need a hand with that hedge? The voice startled him out of his thoughts. He turned, and there she was again, Emily, standing on her side of the fence with gardening gloves in her hands, a light smile touching her face. He grinned. I think I'm managing, though this bush has a mind of its own. She laughed softly. It always did. Your grandmother used to scold it for growing faster than she could trim it. Daniel set the shears down. I remember. She said plants have personalities. Guess I didn't believe her until now. Emily rested her arms on the top of the fence, watching him. You're a lot like her, you know. Same patience. Same quiet way of caring for things. That made him pause. He looked up, caught off guard by her words. I never thought of it that way. She shrugged gently. It's true. You were always thoughtful, even as a boy. There was a long, easy silence between them, not awkward, but filled with quiet understanding. The wind moved through the trees, scattering petals across the ground. Emily smiled, remembering. Do you remember the time you tried to build a birdhouse for me? You must have been, 11? Daniel laughed. I remember it falling apart before I even finished painting it. She joined in his laughter. You were so disappointed. But you looked at me and said, "Don't worry, I'll build a better one next summer." And you did. That's right, he said, smiling at the memory. Though the birds never used it. They didn't need to, she said softly. It was perfect just the way it was. For a moment, Daniel couldn't find words. There was something about her tone, gentle, wistful, that carried more meaning than the words themselves. They talked for hours that day. About the past, about small-town stories, about how much had changed and how much had stayed the same. Emily spoke of her late husband with warmth, not sadness, describing him as a good man who loved the soil more than the sky. Daniel listened, admiring how she spoke of loss without bitterness. It made him think about his awe. The following week passed in a blur of quiet mornings and soft golden afternoons. Daniel found comfort in the rhythm of small things, brewing coffee for his grandmother, mending the old fence, and watching the sun sink behind the trees each evening. Yet, somewhere between those simple moments, his thoughts kept drifting next door. Every time he saw the faint glow of Emily's kitchen light through the trees, an old, almost forgotten warmth stirred inside him. It wasn't romantic in the way people might imagine it. It was something deeper, quieter. A pull toward the peace she carried, the kindness that had once steadied him as a boy. And yet there was something different about seeing her now. Time had changed them both. The distance of years had made every conversation feel fragile, as if they were both afraid to disturb the calm they'd found. It was on a rainy Wednesday afternoon that fate decided to step in. The rain came suddenly thick, heavy drops falling from a gray sky that swallowed the sunlight whole. Daniel had been out checking the mailbox when the downpour began. In seconds, he was soaked through. Laughing at the sky's sudden cruelty, he started to run for shelter when he heard someone calling his name. Daniel, over here. Emily stood on her porch holding the door open. Without thinking, he sprinted toward her house, splashing through puddles until he reached the steps. "Come inside before you catch your death," she said, her tone half stern, half amused. He stepped in, dripping water across her doormat. The house smelled like cinnamon and rain-soaked wood. Everything looked almost exactly as he remembered, the shelves filled with books, the framed paintings of flowers, and the same round table by the window where she used to write letters. "Sorry about the mess," he said, shaking his hair like a drenched dog. She laughed. "You're the one bringing the storm in, Daniel." He smiled, rubbing his hands dry with the towel she offered. "I guess the weather missed me." As the rain beat gently against the windows, Emily handed him a steaming mug of tea. They sat across from each other, listening to the distant thunder roll through the hills. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It felt like the kind of silence shared by two people who no longer needed to fill every space with words. "I can't remember the last time I just sat and listened to the rain," Daniel said softly. "Life gets too loud for it," Emily replied, stirring her tea. "But quiet moments, they wait for us, like old friends." He nodded, watching her face in the candlelight. Her eyes had a faraway look, as if she were lost in a memory. "You know," she began, "I used to watch the rain with my husband. We'd sit on this very porch and say that storms made the world feel alive again. Even when things were hard, we never missed one." Daniel hesitated. "You must miss him." She smiled faintly. "Every day. But grief changes with time. It becomes softer, like the echo of a song you once loved." He took a slow breath. "That's beautifully said." "Maybe," she said with a small shrug. "Or maybe it's just what keeps me standing." The rain fell harder. The power flickered once, twice, and then went out completely. For a moment, they were surrounded by the sound of the storm and the soft glow of a single candle on the table. "Well," Emily said lightly, "looks like dinner will have to wait." Daniel grinned. "Guess we'll have to make conversation instead." She raised an eyebrow. "You make it sound like a challenge." He laughed quietly. "Not with you." The warmth in the room deepened. It wasn't the kind that comes from heat or light. It was something human, something unspoken. The years between them seemed to fade, leaving only two souls connected by memory and time. Do you ever think about the past? Daniel asked after a while. Emily's expression softened. All the time. The people we loved, the choices we made, the moments that could have gone differently. But I try not to get lost in the what-ifs. They can steal the joy from what's still ahead. He nodded slowly. I used to think the past didn't matter, that moving forward meant leaving it behind. But coming back here, it feels like I'm finding pieces of myself I didn't know I'd lost. She met his gaze, her eyes glistening in the candlelight. Maybe the past isn't something to escape. Maybe it's what teaches us how to love again, just differently this time. There was a quiet knock on the door, then Margaret's helper from down the road, dropping off a basket of soup for Emily since the storm had cut off power. Daniel took it for her, setting it on the counter as he did. His hand brushed against an old photograph propped against a jar of daisies. It was faded, the corners worn, but the image was unmistakable, his younger self. No more than 12, standing beside Emily, both smiling proudly beside a crooked wooden birdhouse. He froze. You kept this. Emily walked over, her eyes soft. Of course I did. It was one of my favorite memories. You were so proud of that birdhouse. I thought you would have thrown it away years ago. She smiled. Some things are worth keeping, even the imperfect ones. Something shifted in Daniel's chest, a quiet ache, mixed with warmth. He realized that the bond they'd shared all those years ago hadn't disappeared. It had only been waiting quietly for life to bring them back to the same porch under the same storm by the time the rain stopped. The air was cool and filled with the scent of wet earth. Emily handed him his coat at the door. Thank you, he said softly, for the tea. And for reminding me what quiet feels like. She smiled gently. You're welcome, Daniel. You should come by more often. The garden's not the same without company. As he stepped into the night, he turned back one last time. The candles still glowed faintly through the window, framing her silhouette in warm light. And for the first time in years, Daniel didn't feel lost. He didn't feel like a visitor passing through. He felt like someone who had finally come back to the right place at the right moment. Maybe it wasn't just chance that had brought the storm that day. Maybe it was fate, whispering softly through the rain. The days that followed the storm were filled with an odd kind of calm. The world seemed slower, quieter, as if the rain had washed away not only the dust from the earth, but something heavy from Daniel's heart too. Every morning, he helped his grandmother in the garden and shared tea on the porch with her, listening to stories from her youth. Yet more and more, his eyes wandered to the fence line, to the familiar sight of Emily, tending her flowers with steady hands and a faraway look in her eyes. Sometimes she caught him watching and waved with a faint smile. Other times she seemed lost in thought, her face softened by something like sorrow. And though neither of them said it aloud, Daniel could feel it, a quiet thread between them, tugging at something unspoken, something real. One evening, as the sun began to dip below the trees, Daniel found himself walking toward her garden again. He told himself it was just to return the umbrella she had lent him during the storm. But deep down he knew it was more than that. Emily was kneeling by her rose bushes, trimming away the wilted petals. The light of the setting sun painted her hair gold, and her hands moved with a patient grace that made even simple tasks seem meaningful. You take gardening seriously, he said lightly, trying to sound casual. She looked up smiling. Roses demand patience. They bloom only for those who stay long enough to see them through the rough days. He nodded, stepping closer. Kind of like people. Her smile faded, not with sadness, but with thought. Yes, she said softly. Exactly like people. They stood there in silence for a moment, the air between them filled with the faint scent of roses and earth. It wasn't uncomfortable, just heavy with the kind of words that never found their way out. Can I ask you something? Daniel said at last. Of course, she replied, still clipping a stem. Why did you stay here all these years? You could have moved anywhere. Started over. Emily paused, setting the scissors down. Her eyes followed the horizon for a long while before she spoke. Because leaving doesn't always heal, she said. Sometimes it just makes the quiet louder. This house, this garden, they're part of my story, even the painful parts." Daniel listened, feeling the weight in her words. "You must have loved him very much," he said gently, referring to her late husband. She nodded. "I did. He was a kind man. But kindness doesn't always protect us from distance. Even when we shared a roof, sometimes I felt like I was already alone." Her honesty caught him off guard. There was no bitterness in her tone, just truth. A truth shaped by years of endurance and grace. He said softly, "You deserved more than loneliness." She looked at him then, her eyes warm and steady. "So did you?" Her words settled between them, like falling leaves, quiet, natural, inevitable. Daniel's chest tightened. "What do you mean?" She smiled faintly. "You were always reaching for something, even as a boy. You wanted to make everyone proud, to never disappoint anyone. But I could see how lonely that made you. You've been running ever since." He opened his mouth to reply, but no words came. She wasn't wrong. His success in the city, the long hours, the endless chase for something better. It all suddenly felt like proof of what she'd just said. "I guess I thought if I kept moving, I'd find what I was missing," he said finally. "And did you?" she asked. He met her eyes, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not until now." For a long moment, neither of them moved. The last rays of sunlight stretched across the garden, bathing everything in amber light. "I never told you this," Emily said, breaking the silence. "But after you left for college, your grandmother used to tell me about your letters. She'd read them aloud sometimes." Autumn crept in quietly, softening the edges of summer. The leaves around the small town began to turn gold and crimson, falling in slow spirals across the old garden fences. For Daniel, each passing day felt both peaceful and heavy. Peaceful because of the calm he found in that little town, and heavy because of the words that still hung between him and Emily, unspoken yet ever present. He tried to convince himself that what he felt was just nostalgia, a longing for the simplicity of youth, for the days when kindness and comfort came easily. But every time he saw Emily, her gentle smile, her thoughtful eyes, he felt something deeper stirring within him, something that couldn't be explained away by memory alone. And he could sense that she felt it too. The way she paused when he spoke, the softness in her tone when she said his name, it was all there, hidden behind politeness and time. Still, neither of them dared to say it. One cool afternoon, Daniel helped his grandmother stack firewood behind the house. The old woman, sharp as ever, watched him quietly before saying, "You've been spending a lot of time next door lately." Daniel chuckled. "She's good company." "I'll bet she is," his grandmother said knowingly, her eyes glinting. "You always did look for people with gentle hearts. Emily's had one since the day she moved in." He smiled faintly, unsure what to say. His grandmother patted his arm. "Just remember, dear, life doesn't hand us perfect timing. Sometimes it just gives us moments, and it's up to us to see what they mean." Her words lingered long after he went inside that evening. A few days later, Emily invited him over for dinner. The invitation had been casual. "I made too much soup. Help me finish it," but Daniel could tell she'd thought about it. Her table was neatly set. Candles flickered softly. And a faint melody played from a small radio on the counter. "It's just a simple meal," she said as he sat down. "I don't entertain much these days." "It's perfect," he replied sincerely. They ate slowly. The conversation light memories of the neighborhood, stories about his grandmother, bits of laughter woven between pauses of quiet understanding. The warmth in the room was gentle, like being wrapped in something familiar. But under that warmth was tension, not the uncomfortable kind, but the kind that builds when two hearts keep circling around the truth. After dinner, Emily poured them both tea. Rain began to fall lightly outside, tapping softly on the window. She stared at the steam curling from her cup before speaking. "Daniel," said quietly, "can I tell you something without you thinking less of me?" He looked at her, surprised by the vulnerability in her tone. "Of course." She hesitated, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. There were times after you left for the city when I'd walk past your grandmother's porch and miss hearing your laughter. You brought such light to this place. And I suppose, without meaning to, I started looking for that same light in my own life again. Daniel's chest tightened. You never told me that. She smiled faintly. It wasn't something to say out loud. You were young, and I was already building a life of my own. But I think part of me always wondered if you ever thought of this place after you left. I did, he said softly. More often than I should admit. Her eyes lifted to meet his, glistening with something she couldn't quite hide. Then maybe we both spent years missing something we didn't understand. A long silence followed, broken only by the sound of the rain. Daniel could feel the air shift heavier with meaning. He wanted to speak, to tell her how often he'd thought of her over the years during moments of loneliness, when the city felt too loud and empty. But the right words wouldn't come. Instead, he said the only thing that felt true. Emily, you've always been part of what home means to me. Her breath caught softly, almost imperceptibly. You don't mean that. I do, he said, steady and sincere. When I was a boy, you were the first person who made me believe kindness could change things. You still are. For the first time, she didn't look away. The years seemed to fall from her face in that moment, all the quiet grief. All the hidden longing, Daniel, she whispered. You have no idea how much that means to me. He smiled, though his heart felt full to the edge. Maybe it's something we both needed to say. Then, just as the air between them grew thick with emotion, the phone rang. Emily blinked, startled by the sound, and rose to answer it. It was his grandmother. Daniel could hear her faint voice through the receiver, worried and tired. She had tripped in the hallway. Emily hung up quickly, her expression changing from tenderness to concern. Come on, I'll drive. Within minutes. They were both out the door, rain still falling as they hurried down the familiar road. When they reached the house, Daniel's grandmother was sitting up on the couch, bruised but smiling faintly. I told you I'm fine, she said. I just slipped on that silly rug. Emily knelt beside her, checking her pulse and fussing gently. The care in her voice was so natural, so full of love, that Daniel felt his heart twist, watching them. He realized the truth he'd been avoiding. It wasn't just admiration he felt for Emily. It was something far deeper, something that had quietly grown between them over the years, rooted in kindness, time, and shared understanding. Later that night, after his grandmother was resting and the rain had stopped, Daniel walked Emily back to her porch. The moonlight washed everything in silver. Thank you, he said quietly. She shook her head. You don't have to thank me. She's family, and so are you, in a way. He hesitated, searching her face. Maybe that's what scares me. Her brows lifted slightly. Scares you? He nodded slowly. Because I don't know if I can keep pretending that what I feel is just friendship. Not anymore. Her breath caught, and for a heartbeat the world seemed to still. Daniel, she whispered, her voice trembling between hesitation and understanding. He stepped back slightly, giving her space. You don't have to say anything. I just needed you to know. The silence that followed was long and heavy, but not cold. Emily looked at him with eyes full of emotion, the kind that held both fear and tenderness. Finally, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, You have the most honest heart I've ever known. And though the words didn't answer everything, they said enough. That night, as Daniel walked back home under the stars, he knew nothing between them would ever be quite the same again. Something had shifted gently, irrevocably, like the moment before dawn. When darkness finally begins to give way to light, the first snowfall of the season came quietly, dusting the town in white and muting the edges of the world. Daniel stood at his grandmother's porch, watching the flakes drift lazily to the ground, each one delicate and fleeting. The garden, once alive with roses and lilacs, was now soft under a blanket of snow, yet it seemed no less beautiful. It was a world paused, holding its breath. And Daniel felt something similar within himself, a sense of stillness after months of quiet. Emotional storms. He had spent the morning helping his grandmother rearrange firewood near the back shed. laughing at her teasing comments and savoring the warmth that came from simple, shared moments. Life had settled into a slower rhythm here, one that reminded him of his childhood and the quiet joys that often went unnoticed in the rush of the city. But even with the peace of routine, his thoughts kept returning to Emily. The emotional turning point they had reached weeks ago had shifted everything. The unspoken feelings, the gentle confessions, the shared understanding of loss and longing. All of it had laid a foundation that neither time nor distance could erase. That afternoon, Emily's familiar voice called from the fence. "Daniel, come help me with the snow." He smiled, brushing the light dusting from his coat, and walked across the yard. She was already shoveling the path in front of her porch, her movements steady and careful. The winter air carried the faint scent of pine and the sharp sweetness of frozen earth. "You're shoveling all by yourself?" he asked. "I like to keep busy," she replied with a grin. "And I knew you'd come running." He laughed softly, grabbing a spare shovel. "You know me too well." They worked side by side, shoveling snow in companionable silence. The physical work made space for the quiet emotions that had been lingering. A subtle current flowing beneath the ordinary task. For the first time in years, Daniel felt completely present, completely grounded. As the path cleared, they paused, leaning on their shovels to catch their breath. Emily looked at him, her cheeks flushed from the cold, eyes reflecting something he couldn't quite name. A mixture of warmth, admiration, and relief. "You know," she said softly, "I never thought life would bring us back together like this. I expected what? A few letters from your grandmother, maybe a quick visit. But this feels different." Daniel nodded, understanding immediately. "It does. It feels like coming home in a way I didn't know I was missing." She smiled faintly. "I was afraid of feeling this again. Afraid of wanting something I didn't think I could have." He looked at her with gentle reassurance. "Emily, the truth is, I've always carried this feeling with me. Even as a boy, even in the city, it never went away." Her hand hovered over the fence for a moment, almost reaching. Then she smiled and let it rest on the top. "And I never stopped thinking of you, Daniel. Not once. Even when life felt heavy, you were in the quiet corners of my mind, a reminder that kindness and hope still exist." The air between them seemed to shift. There were no dramatic confessions shouted across rooms, no sudden G's.